Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host, Dusty O'Connell, still the host with the moster after all these years. Joining me, as per usual, is our esteemed co-host, Minnesota Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm really great. I'm feeling super great today because after the extended episode we posted last week, we got a rather generous contribution, the largest one we've ever gotten via Patreon subscription. So I wanted to give a quick tip of the cap, if I can get that out all at once, to Andrew Williams for donating at the $15 a month level. Andrew is willing to skip one latte a week and then an additional one over the course of a month in order to support the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. So for all of you out there who are not currently donors to the show, if you've been listening, especially for multiple years, we would really appreciate it if you would step up like Andrew did and become a recurring contributor to the show at patreon.com/NorseCode. Or if you want to just make a one-time contribution, you can do that too at paypal.me/NorseCode. This week we got a great interview for you. We managed to get Kyle Krabs, who you may recognize as the author of the NFL Draft Prospectus, or the founder of NDT Scouting, or you might know him from his work on the Draft Dudes podcast. But first-time guest, welcome to the show, Kyle. How you doing?
Hey, thanks for having you guys. It's always a joy to talk football, so no complaints here.
Well, then that is
solid.
That is what we're here to do.
All right, so we've got the Combine coming up. I know you've got, a very specific system for how you end up grading your prospects, and that takes into account something that you do called an athleticism score. But before we go into the nitty-gritty, and I kind of want to do that in a little bit, I just want some of your general thoughts. How much does the Combine or even pro day testing, how much does that matter to you, and how much do you think that matters to the NFL?
Sure. Well, I think each and every franchise kind of has their own approach to how they quantify that information. And a lot of times, you see with regime changes, there's kind of a reshuffling of the philosophies here because it really is, there's no cut and dry way to use this information. There's a lot of different applications and research that you can do, and I think each team kind of weighs on it more than others, and you see some teams that are willing to invest early and often in poor testing athletes. But I think the more research that's put into applications and historical data, the more you'll see teams quantified in some way, shape, or form. For me personally, it's more of a supplement, especially because I don't have access to the medicals, which is obviously the biggest part of the Combine as far as what players have to prove there is their durability and ability to hold up through the ground and pound of an NFL season. But it's more of a supplementary piece. I've actually kind of adjusted the way I do my assessments this year, where the athleticism testing is normalized with historical data in comparison to size. So you're blending the size and athleticism profiles into a singular metric. So an average athlete, if you're average size, you will not score as well as an average athlete if you are a larger individual in comparison to players who have passed through the Combine.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and it brings up something that I think is kind of a curious, component at the Combine. Some teams will place some pretty significant weight on a couple of the tests, like the 40 is maybe the most famous example. Other teams don't seem to care as much about the athletic testing so much as they do the size measuring. So do you think that what athletes, and obviously this changes from team to team, but what athletes measure in at in terms of arm length, hand size, weight, height, you think that might actually have just a bigger impact, in a standardized setting? That might have a bigger impact than the difference between a running back who runs a 4.45 and a running back who runs a 4.55?
Yeah, and I think even some of the stuff that's not accessible, like your range of motion testing.
Right, like the flexibility tests, yeah.
Yeah, like all that kind of stuff is huge, because that kind of application you could turn around and look at, is it functional or is it dysfunctional? So if you got a guy that has a pliable body, but he doesn't play with looseness, you can at least say, okay, he's physically capable of doing so, as compared to if you're tight, you're tight. You can only do so much, calf raises and ankle flexion stuff before you've reached your cap as far as how loose your body physiologically is going to allow you to be. So I think a lot of that, even some circumference testing, I know you guys are very familiar with the concept of skinny knees. That kind of stuff, I think that's really underrated, because it's not accessible. We don't touch any of that, and teams apply that data as they choose and see fit.
Yeah, so Vikings fans have been making a lot of fun of the skinny knees thing, but I mean, there's actually kind of a history of like measuring where the bone is not impacted by the muscle as a proxy to get like how big someone's frame can be or how much muscle they can take and still play at a natural weight, right?
Right, and I know there has been some research done into ankle flexion as well, and its correlation to lower body injuries, and that tightness in the ankles is a pretty statistically significant indicator of lower body injuries over the long term.
All right. Well, okay. So let's talk a little bit about the way that you do sort of athleticism testing, given the information that we have sort of generally publicly available to us. Naturally, I imagine it's a different weight for each position. But as you're doing this historical testing, were there any positions that stood out that you were surprised at how little or how much that athleticism testing mattered?
Well, it doesn't necessarily surprise you that your interior offensive line and your quarterbacks, it's negligible, right?
Right.
Not functionally applicable positions. But you've seen, or at least I've seen with what I've done, you'll get some outliers and skill players on the boundary, but your running backs, it's a really good indication of baseline athletic ability. If you're under, the way that I do the scoring is it's all compiled data, and you're looking at Z-scores outside of that mean score of the past 12 years of data of that player at that position at that specific test. So the more standard deviations away from the mean you are, the better or worse your score is. And I think with running backs, I believe it's the 40th percentile off the top of my head. If you're below that, you have a pretty significant uphill climb to relevance, especially at the running back position, where there's such a plethora and wealth of players that have baseline level skills.
So then I guess the next question that kind of follows a little bit naturally from that, do you find it difficult as roles have become more and more well known? We used to not know as a general public about, crazily enough, the difference between an under tackle and a nose tackle, or the difference between a nickel corner and an outside corner, and we used to not care about scat backs and stuff like that. But as these roles are getting more defined in public awareness, do you find it difficult to, as there's an increasing number of roles and then functionally positions, do you find it difficult to find ways to determine how athletic testing will fit how somebody fits in a role? Because I imagine if you're playing as a 2-gap 5 technique, that's a lot different than a 1-gap 3 technique in terms of the athletic, ability that you would need to succeed at that position. Do you find that something that you're trying to work your way around, or how are you dealing with that issue?
Yeah, that has been something I've ran into each of the past 2 years with separate position groups. So the under tackle versus nose tackle was really challenging. So I had to do some shuffling of the deck in terms of not necessarily. So I split the athletic testing for the nose tackles, where they're not weighted on the same curve as your 3 techs, because it's stupid, right? These
right.
are guys that they sit there and eat space. It's their job.
I ran into the exact same problem. Yeah.
And then the other one was I actually went out of my way when I was initially setting up the system to retroactively score players that were in the NFL as 5 techs, as your so instead it was originally just supposed to be interior defensive line. But that specificity, I didn't see it quite as much with the nickel corner versus boundary corner. But I've kicked around the idea of doing it with free safety and strong safety, because that nickel linebacker safety hybrid, that's a really difficult foil, because a lot of those guys are such outliers in comparison to historically your rangy safeties, and you guys that you're playing on the back end have a lot more twitch and movement skills as compared to some of those tweeners. But again, I try not to sweat it too much, because at the end of the day, it's a supplement to the film. So if a guy has really strong film, but he's athletically kind of a tweener, 9 times out of 10, that tweener athletic testing is going to put him into approximately the range that a player like that should end up be valued in anyway.
So at that point, it's not so much about changing a grade on a player as it is, checking a box. Like, are you, threshold, have you met, the appropriate standards for a player who is going to end up in this role or whatever, right?
Right. So it's the analogy that I've made is the film sets the tier of the quality of the player that you are. And then your peripheral metrics, which include productivity, this new PSAR metric, which is physical size and athleticism score, and experience. Those 3 peripheral metrics are really just applied to help sort the deck in between your first round values and your fringe first versus early second, and all the way down the board.
So have you found, as you've gone through, that there were top 5 picks that tested poorly at a position where you found athletic testing really matters a lot, that you were just like, I don't care, his film is so good, I know he's a wide receiver or whatever, but I don't care, his film is so good that he's in a tier by himself, there's no reason for me to move his grade?
The weirdest one I've got is Jarvis Landry.
That's fair. He ran like a 4.7.
Jarvis's film score was a first-round score, and his size and his athletic testing were both like 35th percentile or lower, like across the board. And it's like, man, so I played around a lot with that one, because I had a ton of conflicts regarding, obviously the film's there, he can play, and then I gave him a first-round film grade, and then those other metrics ended up dragging him down like 2 whole rounds worth. So he ended up with, retroactively applied to how I weight the metrics now, he was like an early 3. And he went late 2. So again, it's kind of that checks and balances. And if you asked me then and there, should Jarvis Landry be that far down on the board? My answer would have been no, but the whole objective behind the supplemental metrics is it's meant to act as a checks and balances and protect you from your own internal biases, whether you're self-aware of them or not.
Right. Well, so that's like another sort of interesting. One thing that, and this is what Josh Norris says a lot when he's talking about the way that we evaluate combine testing. One thing that might get away from us is, if we're using the combine and, say production as a way to modify our approach to film, say, hey, we've got a baseline film score, and then this will nudge it up or down a little bit. If we're doing that, how do we avoid something like double counting? So a player like Will Fuller, a player like John Ross, the way that you evaluate that player's film will inherently take into account just how blazing fast they are. That's just going to be part of what they do. It's not, like a slot receiver who, you might not actually know how fast they are because of, the different variables that go into playing that position. But, I mean, they're a pure deep threat, right? So, they run like a 4.37, that's their job. How do you avoid double counting that when you start weighting things around?
Yeah, I found more of a conflict with that in size than I did with the athleticism testing, and the reason why is a lot of your, say, interior offensive line or your corners, there is such thing as being too big, right? Like, it can be a physiologically limiting factor in preventing you from moving with quickness, and, you see guys like Dan Skipper, the Arkansas offensive tackle, who are really tight, really rigid. Their steps are long, so they can't mirror quite as well. Or, defensive backs on the boundary with that step frequency. If you are 6'3", like Stanley Jean-Baptiste or Keith McGill, who for some reason got really pumped up in 2014 when he was out because he was like 6'2", legit 6'2". Unless you're a really special athlete, physiologically, that is a really limiting factor. So I had initially planned on factoring, if your standard deviation is too far above the mean, that I would score it as a bad thing too, because you can be too big. But then I stopped and realized that very same concept of he's already getting penalized in the film if he can't move this well. So why would I double penalize him by counting it against his size score when it's already accounted for the physiological limitation that it is with his on-the-field product?
Well, that makes sense. So as you're kind of moving forward, are there any... Well, let's tackle this sort of like position by position. What are you looking for from a player like Leonard Fournette at running back, who we expect to be really fast for his size? He's going to run probably a great 40. And the question for him is probably going to be, how he does in those agility tests. Historically, it seems like, and maybe your data has told you something else. Historically, it seems like those agility tests don't give us as much information as that raw speed. But like his agility is probably the biggest question, and it might determine whether or not he's a top 15 guy for some people, a top 30 guy for some people, what have you. Like, what are you looking for from him specifically?
Yeah, Fournette, I think it's really evident when you watch the film that his lateral mobility is not present. He does a nice job adjusting and altering his step frequency and stride length when he's bottled up, either at the point of attack or when he's pressing the line of scrimmage. But from him, the expectation is, especially with his size, he's going to have a really nice ratio of the explosiveness and the 10-yard split and the jumps. And I do factor in something called a explosion score, a speed score for running backs, which is your ratio of your size. And I've been working on trying to find a way to implement some density factors there in terms of how fast and explosive you are. So for Fournette, you want to see that 40 that's in the 4.4s. You want to see that jump that's 36, 37. You want to see notably above standard deviation testing, because that's where he wins, is that explosiveness and power and straight line speed. So he's not going to be a guy that runs a great 3-cone time or short shuttle time. It's not his game. So you're looking for the reaffirmation of, this is where I know he wins. Let's see it in athletic testing the way we see it on the film.
So if Fournette runs like a 4.58 at the combine and maybe also the pro day, how do you like take that into account? You factor it in, because we all expect this dude to be extremely fast for his size. And if he runs poorly in, 2 different trials at the combine, 2 different trials at the pro day, what does that tell you? How do you evaluate that?
That's where you have to go back to the tape, right? You got to go back and look and say, okay, what are the circumstances in which he's able to hit that second level so hard? And everybody's seen that clip of him running over that poor soul from Ole Miss up the boundary and putting a guy in a coffin, essentially. That kind of force, if that disconnect is there, then maybe I start looking at, okay, what's his 10-yard split? Does he just not know how to run a 40? Does he not know how to get out of the stance? because that if he runs like you suggested and alluded to, if he runs high 4.5s, that's a really stark disconnect from what you saw on film. So though you get probably 2 or 3 of those a year where it's just like, man, like that's such a, I can't put my thumb on what that is. So you'll end up going back to tape and looking to see if there's anything you can pick up on, and then you'll start searching the athletic testing for, well, as I said, if it's just, does he have a really bad 10-yard split, and look at his stance, and is somebody getting fired because they sent him to the wrong training facility and he doesn't know how to run a 40?
So that brings up another question that I find kind of interesting. So one of the reasons that I've always appreciated the combine, and one of the reasons I think that the combine is relatively underrated by a lot of fans and a lot of NFL analysts, is that one of the things that it tests, without you knowing whether or not it tests it, is coachability. Like you were just talking about, if he doesn't know how to run a 40, maybe he had bad 40 coaches, right? And that happens. It might have happened to the entire TCU staff. What happens if, let's say they go to Exos, just some other relatively well-known combine training facility, and he doesn't know how to run a 40? Do you think that that kind of just accounts, hey, maybe this kind of accidentally tested that he doesn't know how to change his style of doing things athletically? Maybe this isn't an athletic demerit, but it is an indication that it'll take him a while to learn to do things a different way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept, and another wrinkle to this that, as you said, the casual fan rolls their eyes at the combine and says it's a bunch of guys running out there in underwear, but it's like the weigh-ins for all-star games or weigh-ins for this. It's you're taking into account everything, and anybody and everybody who's there is looking for a reason not to like you. They're looking for a reason to not make you be their draft selection. So if you, over the course of, and I hear somebody is sitting there somewhere is having some snark to say, if he doesn't figure out how to run a 40, then he's in trouble because he took the extra time off to go train because he didn't play in his bowl game.
Right.
I guarantee you somebody in the NFL, if that were the case, somebody will connect those dots and they will bring up that point and they will say, look, he took extra time to train. He trained for 2 months, 2.5 months, and he couldn't pick up this concept. So we need to really get him in the film room and break him down and ask him to break down his own film and what he's seeing and see, is he just some prodigy that, like Dan Marino always said, he just picked the open guy and threw it to him. That was how he explained how he did good things on the football field. Or if conceptually he can understand the concepts that he's being asked to apply.
Right. Okay, well, so there's a couple of other running backs I want to ask you quickly about, and we don't have to go through every position and every player, but running backs are kind of like a feature position at the combine. Guy that I am maybe not in love with, I have no idea what your thoughts are on, is running back from Tennessee. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Alvin Kamara, I think. Kamara. Yeah. So he's a guy that some people are saying, hey, he's a power back, which I don't really see. Hey, he's explosive, which I don't really see. But this is something that I haven't been evaluating running backs all year. I've been evaluating them for 2 weeks because I'm an NFL guy. This is something where athletic testing is going to mean maybe a lot for me to them. So obviously it doesn't really matter as much to say an actual draft evaluator, but if he tests explosively, it might change my mind. But what do you expect from him from a testing perspective in terms of explosion?
You know what he is? He's smooth. So I don't know if he's necessarily going to have explosive straight line speed. You can see he has a visible second gear, but it's not like that game breaking speed that, oh my God, this guy's going to run 4.4 flat. I think probably high 4.4s, low 4.5s is a good expectation for him. If he comes in faster than that, then great. But that's kind of what I expect to see from him in that regard. I do think his jumps are going to be particularly good. You see a lot of opportunities with the lower body looseness that he displays, and a couple instances of him jumping over other human beings on a dead sprint and doing so with ease. So I think his jumps will probably be a little better just based off of what I've seen on the film than what his straight line long speed is. But I'm kind of with you that I don't think he's game breaking as far as the speed that he brings to the table. And he's certainly not a power back. He's got a leaner frame. Leg drive's not particularly strong in those situations, and he runs a little high sometimes. So I wouldn't expect to see a whole lot of raw power out of him.
All right, and then a guy that Vikings fans have suddenly become super interested in, and I think I've played a role in that, is Kareem Hunt, Toledo running back. He's a guy that I like a lot. He doesn't feel like a guy, though, that I think will test well. I think that he's a physically very capable back, but he's physically capable sort of in the same way, and I think the comp I gave for him maybe was D'Angelo Williams, but in the same way that like Williams or who did test well, so hold my tongue a little bit, or Marshawn Lynch, they're balanced guys. They take hits, the hits slide off of them, and they keep running, which is not something. I mean, you can kind of see a little bit of the 3-cone, and even less of it a little bit in the flying 20, and even less in the short shuttle. But balance is like a difficult thing to sort of evaluate quantitatively, given what we have in terms of combine tests. Do you think that someone like Kareem Hunt will end up testing well enough? What do you think about him?
Yeah, I think this gets back into the original discussion that we had started off on with running backs and baseline testing, 40th percentile. I think he'll be above that because I think functionally he is a good enough athlete, but I think where he wins best is balance, as you said, his ability to string cuts together, and his vision. So those three components really stand out on his film, where he does that dynamic lateral cut into another forward cut, and his ability to pick his way through traffic and see defensive flow. You can't test that. I think in the open field he shows enough, and obviously his lateral mobility with some of his jump cuts covers a pretty good amount of ground, but he's also built low to the ground, so that change of direction skill is naturally a little easier for him than a lot of other backs. But I'm with you. I really like him. I think he'll test good enough, but not good necessarily. But that should not be held against him.
And the last guy I want to ask about is DAndre Foreman, who a lot of people have been saying, hey, if you don't like the price that Leonard Fournette is going at, you could get DAndre Foreman later. Seems like it's just a size comp. Fournette always seems to get 2 more yards after contact than Foreman does. Foreman seems to be, sort of looser, which is a word that you seem to like using a lot when you're describing athletes who have the ability to sort of, especially move with their lower body. I don't like that as a comp, but it will be interesting, sort of the way that Foreman tests. What are you expecting out of him?
Yeah, it's lazy analysis, right? It's just, they're both big. So
they're big.
Same guy.
They're all Derrick Henry, right?
Yeah, they're all Derrick Henry. And Derrick Henry was, what was the ridiculous comp for him the other year?
That he was a fullback?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, him and Mike Allstott are totally the same guy.
Oh, yeah.
But I like Foreman. I like Foreman a good deal. The thing he gets dinged for too, I guess, is his holes that he's hitting at Texas were massive. And it's true. But you did see opportunities with him where he was able to pick the feet up and put them down. I think he does that better than Fournette as far as finding his way through murky waters at the line of scrimmage. I don't think he's going to have great testing relative to the historical data, but again, you get into the size, and this is why I've normalized that athleticism testing data with size scores and blending them into one weighted score. Is he's a really big guy for running back, and it's like the same thing with Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry was like one of the 5 best combine performers when you foiled what he was able to illustrate and display athletically with how big he was. I think you'll see a little lesser version of that with Foreman. So I don't think he'll be in the top 5, but he'll probably be inside the top 30, 40. I think if you normalize his athleticism testing with his size, you're going to get a really nice result.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then for the receivers, I haven't dug into the receivers too much, but aside from, John Ross and Katie Cannon, there's not a lot of talk about how athletic these receivers are. Is it the case that this might end up being a less athletic receiver class than we're used to seeing? Not saying that last year's receiver class was amazingly athletic or anything like that, but just generally speaking, it doesn't seem like outside of those two guys that we may see, and that's just speed, but, maybe we'll see a guy with like great vert or whatever. But do you think that there are going to be some athletic surprises among receiver testing?
I think you're going to get some really nice athletic testing from a number of different guys. I think Chad Hansen's going to jump through the ceiling from Cal. If you watch some of his applied explosiveness and ability to elevate, high point the football, was really pleasantly surprised with what I saw from him in that regard. I think Carlos Henderson from La Tech is really underrated by a lot of folks. You're starting to see a lot of buzz for him.
Yeah, the buzz is building for him, it seems like.
My goodness. He's the comp I made back in December was Corey Coleman. And you see a lot of similar style wins. I think Coleman's probably more dynamic, but it's just a touch more. But Henderson also brings a little more polish to the table right now as a receiver, so that's a scary thought. Really like what he brings to the table. I think he'll test well. And then the other one that seems to be a good tester, but you don't necessarily always see with applied testing or applied on the field product, is Taywan Taylor out of Western Kentucky. Some of the numbers that are circling from him, they're floating around numbers in the low 4.4s and a high 30s, like a 38, 39 potential vertical jump. So I think there will be a number of really strong testers. I just don't think they're necessarily high-profile guys at this point in the game.
It brings up another question. So we were talking about a player who plays better than what tests may end up producing. What do you do with a player that isn't playing as well as their test? Like, they run a fast 40. It doesn't look like they're running that fast on the field. They're jumping really high, in the vertical leap, but it doesn't look like they can get much elevation, when they're trying to high point the ball. What do you do with a player like that? Do you view it as, hey, it's a different game with pads on. Hey, it's a different game with other players on the field. Do you view it as, hey, the coach just didn't quite unlock his athletic potential. I can do something with it. Or how do you approach that?
Can I say all the above? I think my first initial reaction to something like that is it's either mental processing speed or it's the game is different with your pads on. So some guys just can't move. There's workout warriors. Some guys just can't move the way they move and move freely when they've got to wear the thigh pads and hopefully the girdle with the cup and the shoulder pads.
All right. Well, sort of moving on from those sort of exciting-ish skill positions, probably one of the best positions in the draft is tight end, and there's a lot of potential for some really good testers. O.J. Howard is purported to run below a 4.6. You've got David Njoku. You've got someone like Evan Ingram, who we both were kind of we appreciated what he did at the Senior Bowl. There's a lot of tight ends, and you've got your potential 6'2" guys that test out of the water. Then you've also got your 6'5" guys that might end up testing well too. What are you expecting from this tight end class?
I think you're going to see one of them, if not the most, one of the most talked about position groups once they test, because there are a lot of explosive guys in this group. As you mentioned, Howard and Njoku, Evan Ingram. I don't think Bucky Hodges is a tight end. I also don't think he's particularly explosive, but some people talk about him like he is, so I'll throw him in there. Let's see, guys like Gerald Everett, Janu Smith. Those last two are two of the 6'2" guys that you talked about that move piece guys, Jordan Reed style players. Not that they're on that caliber of a player, but they're valuable move pieces. They can catch the ball. They run quickly and show well in that regard. So a lot of linear straight line speed. I think Howard and Njoku especially, their jumps are going to be massive. Njoku's just a total freak. He might be a better athlete than Howard is. I think he'll probably run a little faster than Howard, but both of those guys are going to be off the charts. And I think it'll be across the board. It's funny. I remember when Eric Ebron came through and everybody talked about how great of a combine he had because he broke 4.6 in his 40, but you looked at his bench, his jumps, his shuttles, like none of the other stuff was particularly good, but he ran a 4.58, so he had a great combine. I think you'll see these top guys, they're going to back up that straight line speed with a lot of really solid testing across the board.
They'll fill up the mock draftable web, really.
Yes. Yes, that spider web will be full.
All right, well, that covers most of the offensive players in terms of the testing that people are interested in. But, while we're on the offense, let's talk a little bit about quarterbacks. Is there anything at all you want to see from quarterbacks at the Combine, at all?
I think they have the least at risk with the workouts. Obviously, the interviews with them are essential.
Right.
The medicals are key, but from the stuff that we're going to see, nobody's going to hurt themselves. Where you talk about how many times the ball hit the ground when Deshaun Watson was throwing the ball at guys that he's never seen before in his life.
Right.
No, I think they are very low leverage, very low risk once they put on the cleats and go out on the field.
Yeah. And then also with quarterbacks, I know that, Benjamin Albright is somebody that we're both familiar with. He tracks with the max velocity, I think, of the balls coming out of the quarterback's hand. I don't know, because he gets his information from someone else. I don't know, whether or not that speed gun they use is, at the release point when the ball is at its fastest, at its peak, or whatever, right? I don't know when the ball is tracked, but he seems to imply that there's a pretty solid history of quarterbacks at the Combine when you have the gun of not doing well if they score below a certain miles per hour with the speed gun. Is that something you've heard about? Is that something that there's not enough data for you to really care about yet, or what is your take on that?
Yeah, and Ben's done nice work with that. I think the threshold's, let's say 58. It's either 55 or 58 off the top of my head.
58 seems high, but I don't have the spreadsheet in front of me, so I couldn't tell you.
But yeah, it's an interesting concept, but it's not something I haven't made any friends in high enough places to give me that. So it's not something that I've been able to work with in my free time or go back and use historical data to look at. But it's an interesting concept because it goes back to you got to have baseline level talent. So I think arm strength, it's much less overrated than what it was probably 5 years ago. Right. Where guys like Ryan Mallett are like somebody's bay because he could throw the ball 80 yards and put it on a rope, but none of the other functional skills are there. So that dialed down, I've been glad to see, but there is a baseline level requirement that you have to have. And that seems to be a nice way to at least get some data, but I would also like to see as sports technology continues to advance, if there's any way that you can do any of that kind of tracking, either in live action or when a player's in pads, or because obviously with a quarterback and the throwing motion, pads make a difference on how you're able to deliver the ball, and a helmet makes a difference on what kind of movement skills your body has and how freely you're able to move. So it's an interesting concept, but I think before I would pursue it further, A, I would need to have historical data, and B, I would need to get a little more functional measurement of the skill. Right.
That makes sense. And then before we talk about defenders, you mentioned internal offensive linemen, whatever, but you specified interior offensive linemen. So you found that testing does matter for those guys playing on the edges.
Yeah, you got to be able to move. You got to be able to mirror. Shuttle scores are pretty notable. Your 10-yard split and your initial get off at the line of scrimmage is pretty notable. Even the jumps to a certain degree have an indication of lower body power and ability in an indirect way to anchor and really squat and sit down to eat up a power rush. I found that to be more relevant on the outside when you're more frequently on an island than what you get from the guys on the inside.
Well, then who do you expect, and this is not a sort of a well-regarded tackle class, who do you expect is going to improve themselves with a good day at the combine. Like, I think, like, for example, like a couple years ago, Jake Fisher, for example, I think, grabbed a lot of attention with his combine. Who do you think is going to be sort of in that range?
Yeah, Fisher was my top tackle in 15, supplemented by, I thought his film was a little underrated, and then supplemented with just how strong of testing he had. DJ Humphries from Florida was another one that had a nice combine because he came in and weighed big and tested well. People were expecting him in the 290s. He came in just under 310, I think. He was like 307, 308. So it's a big difference. So some of those guys can make themselves a lot of money by showing up with functional play size, even if they don't hold it when they get into film. Teams will take that data and say, okay, we can get him this big, and we know this is how athletic he is. I think Cam Robinson is going to have a nice testing week. I don't think he's going to test abnormally high, but he's going to test probably above average in a lot of areas with a really big body. I think Garrett Bowles from Utah has the potential to be that Taylor Lewan, Jake Fisher style tackle.
You can't compare 28-year-olds to 21-year-olds. Come on, man.
No, I know, but his movement skills are nice, and those are the guys that I've gotten honeypotted by in the past, where it's like, oh man, he's got the typewriter feet, he can mirror on the edge. I'm all in on that guy, but I'm not taking the cheese this year because I've gotten bit on those guys in the past, where it was Eric Fisher, who has turned into a really nice offensive tackle, but physically was not ready to play at the NFL level when he came into the league. Jake Fisher. Jason Spriggs, who's done a nice job on the inside, weirdly enough, playing guard for the Packers as a rookie. But the NFL no longer values those guys, and you saw it after what happened with Fisher. The NFL doesn't value those lean, tight end style build guys. So I think somebody like Antonio Garcia, you'll see him because if he's 295, he's had a lot of big breakfasts between the Senior Bowl and and the Combine, because he's so lean. He's a hard gainer. He's going to have a hard time keeping weight on his body. Guys like that, I think they'll test really well, but the league's going to be apprehensive of valuing those guys particularly high, because you've seen over the past couple years, if you're lean, if you've got that tight end build, just happen to be a bigger build than a tight end, but they're more apprehensive to invest in you in the first round. Those are typically like your mid-40s, early 50s range is the value for those kinds of guys.
Do you think that might be a recency bias, or do you think that that's something that, hey, we fell in love with those guys, maybe we were wrong, it's time to move on, because there hasn't really been a strong history, period, of those guys?
I probably a combination of the two. Fisher was rough at first when he went to KC, so that's come around well. I think Lane Johnson's probably the best representation for somebody of that archetype. And 2 suspensions in, he's got to watch himself now, because he had to really work to get his weight up, and that's apparently what this second bust was about, was taking supplements to try and add strength and add weight to his frame. So probably a combination of the two.
All right, and then defensively, a lot of people love this edge class. It seems like, the people that we follow on Twitter and the people who tweet at me and probably tweet at you are very well aware of how important combine testing can be for edge players. First, do you find that to be, one of the bigger relationships that you've seen, or is it maybe just, hey, Justice has gotten really popular with this force players thing, but my data says, maybe it's not as important as people say. Like, where are you on that spectrum?
No, edge players are one of 2 positions that factor in 5 measures of athletic testing. So I don't measure all the tests for all the positions. Each position has a different series of applied tests.
Well, before you continue, then I have one question. How important is bench press for anybody?
Negligible.
Okay.
It's factored in for trench players, but it's more you better have over 18.
Yeah.
If you don't have over 18, then we got a whole other set of problems we got to talk about.
Wow, there's a bad analogy I could make right now. But yeah, okay, so edge players, you've got 5 different dimensions of athletic testing that matter.
Yeah, it's 40 10-yard split, short shuttle, the 3-cone, and the broad jump are the measures that I factor in for those guys. So that plethora of skills makes it pretty vital for those guys to test well across the board, because if not, you're going to start seeing guys that are knocking down kind of what we just talked about with Eric Ebron, where, okay, you had a great 40, but your bench was terrible. Your vertical was below average. I think somebody like Jordan Willis from Kansas State, who's gotten really weirdly popular with a lot of people.
I think a lot of it has to do with his raw production. A lot of it has to do with PFF.
Sure, yeah. And his straight line stuff's going to be great. His long speed's probably going to be pretty good. But that's somebody that I'm not expecting a whole lot of explosiveness in the jumps. I'm not expecting any tangible level of change of direction skills with the 3-cone. So you have to be able to illustrate that you have functional athleticism in some capacity across the board, where somebody like him, people think he can turn the corner. I don't think he can win around the edge with any level of consistency, and I'm looking for confirmation of that anticipation with what his agility testing and numbers show us.
So I've got a question about that then. So seems to be a lot of really good data about this, but there are players who are simply just not that agile. People like, Tamba Hali, for example. I've seen him try to bend the corner, and it's just not a thing that he does. But he's, a really effective edge rusher. I don't think anyone wants to take that away from him. What do you do when you've got a player who is insanely productive in college? And I think that's actually a really fair characterization of how Jordan Willis played this last year. He's really productive. And doesn't have what a lot of people would consider a foundational ability of an edge player, the ability to bend the edge, the ability to play with any level of, ankle flexion. What do you do with a player like that? Do you go, hey, not my team? Do you go, hey, I should probably rate him just a little bit higher based off of the production than I do on my film, because maybe he can find a way to win that I'm not accounting for?
Well, that's one of the key reasons why production is one of the measures that is in the supplemental metrics that I use. So if you have poor athletic testing, but you do produce 9 times out of 10, they will negate each other and cancel each other out with really strong production versus below average athletic testing. You're going to get an average between those two that when it's applied to any particular position group, you're probably talking about maybe 10, 12% of the overall weight of the score. That film score is still 3/4 to 80% of the overall score. Mm-hmm. So that they kind of serve as not just checks and balances for my own brain and my own biases, but also checks and balances for the supplemental metrics that you see across the board.
Sure. Which edge players are you most excited to see in terms of this testing?
I want to see what Taco Charlton does. I want to see how explosive Carl Lawson is. I know he's kind of fallen off because there's a lot of anticipation about some poor medicals with him. And then I'm really interested in Solomon Thomas. Solomon's kind of weird with how Stanford played him and where he played and what he does well and how consistently he wins around the edge. So that's a name that I'm really going to key on, because I think he has a lot to gain from showing well and proving that he has functional athleticism, even if that's not necessarily where he was implemented at Stanford.
Do you think Solomon Thomas will be asked or has been asked to weigh in more than his listed weight at Stanford?
See, I think he would be better served. Was listed like 272?
Yeah.
I would love to see him at 265. I'd like to see him a little leaner because I want to play him on the edge. Some teams will probably have the vision based on their scheme and what they're looking for to have him play at 280, 285, maybe be like a Mario Edwards style build and kind of player. So I could see that pendulum swinging either way, but that whole, it could totally go either way is what has me so interested to see what he does next week.
All right. And then, this is, a lot of people talking about the edge class. Obviously, a lot of people talking about the tight end class. Think that getting kind of lost in the weeds this is a pretty good defensive tackle class. There's some people have favored, some don't. But, I feel like this is a case where, kind of like with edge players, that combine testing might start to separate the cluster, because I think that we've hit a point with both edges and defensive tackles, or interior defensive linemen rather, that there's kind of a cluster. We've got a bunch of players with fringe first-round grades. Do you think that the defensive tackle class is going to have some stars that are going to move out of the fringe category and put themselves in the first round, or some duds that'll put themselves, into the second or maybe even third round?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I don't think the defensive tackle class, as you said, gets recognized for having a number of really strong football players. I think Caleb Brantley is going to be a winner from Florida, the early enroll into the draft. Initial movement skills with him are really strong. That first step and twitch, he combines it with snap anticipation, and I think that's something that a lot of people would be well served trying to raise some self-awareness of, is understanding there's a difference between snap anticipation and actual first step quickness. Like Derek Barnett, for example, has one of the best snap anticipations I've ever seen. But I have to giggle when somebody says he's got an explosive first step. No, he doesn't. He doesn't gain ground all that well. He just gets off the ball quicker than everybody else. As far as the interior guys, I think Jaleel Johnson's somebody that gets talked about as a potential late first round, early second round guy that's probably not going to test all that well, but that's not his game. And I think he'll probably get unfairly penalized for that. The other one that I'm interested in is Malik McDowell from Michigan State. He's gotten tossed around. At the beginning of the year, they were talking like top 20 with him, and he's fallen really quiet, really silent. I think as a tweener, first of all, I'm interested to see where he comes in and then what he does with that weight. But I think he stands to gain a lot if he's able to prove, he's not 280, or maybe he is 280. But if he's 280, he darn well better test really well.
Right. Yeah, because Aaron Donald weighed in pretty light for defensive tackle, around 280, I think. And he's 6'1", so it's not like he was not appropriately bulky, but he tested insanely well. Like he and Jerick McKinnon were like multiple tiers above the rest of the testing class. And so, weighing a small amount, like you said, after you account for size, weighing a small amount isn't bad. It just raises the bar for all the other things that you have to do. So beyond that, linebackers are always an interesting, position to me. The Vikings love these athletic linebackers. Eric Kendricks is, kind of athletic. He's actually, he tested pretty well in 4.66, I think, and he had some pretty good agility scores. Anthony Barr tested through the roof. But one of the most important things anyone ever talks about when they talk about linebackers is recognition and instincts. And so, those are things that can, just like what it does with, people who anticipate the snap well off the edge, those things can be mistaken on the field, for, having a really good burst or a really good 10 split, when instead they just kind of knew what was going to happen with the play. So that's a two-part question, essentially. One, how much do you weight the athletic testing for linebackers? And, two, what tests do matter for them?
Yeah, name like Paul Dawson comes to mind, doesn't it? You'd referenced TCU guys earlier. His film was excellent. Mental processing off the charts. Ran like 4.8? He
ran like a 4.8 at like 235. It was it was something.
I could probably go do that now. I'm not quite 235 though, so I'm going to be a little lower in my PSAR metric. But yeah, I look at both the jumps for them, looking at vertical jump and the broad jump, the 40-yard and the 10-yard for them. I don't look at bench, and I've swung back and forth on factoring in the short shuttle. This year it's in. I had omitted it the last 2 years, but after kind of re-looking at what some of the data that I had was, I decided to toss it back in this year. So it's another position group with 5 tests. Obviously short shuttle with that change of direction skills, redirecting on the second level and reacting to ball flow and reacting to passes. They're more functional as far as in their zone drops, or if they're playing off man against tight end, that ability to redirect and change directions smoothly and with suddenness. Obviously the jumps, you're just looking for lower body explosiveness, that hitting power, ability to roll hips through and unlock the power of through your core down through the feet. I think is really important. So those are a number of tests that I look at for those guys. As far as what I weigh it's, I think, not factoring in the size factor. It works out to be a 7.5-8% supplement to the film score, which for linebackers is 75% of the overall score is the film score. So you got between the 3 other metrics, it's complement the last quarter of the scores between the experience production and the PSAR metric, which is physical size and athleticism.
Okay, and then there's a lot of linebackers in the class. I don't want to go over too many of them, but 2 names that catch my eye. Obviously, Reuben Foster. I think a lot of people expect him to test pretty well. But what about a player like Raekwon McMillan, who produced a lot of tackles for Ohio State, is purported to not have sideline to sideline speed or coverage ability? What are you expecting out of him?
I think his testing's probably going to be about average. And the reason I say about average is you look at linebackers, defenses are getting smaller and smaller and faster. I think Atlanta is a good example of that with what their defense was this year. They had one huge safety in Keanu Neal, and their linebackers were leaner, more fluid. Deion Jones. Devondre Campbell actually had some nice length to him, but he wasn't especially big. You're looking for defensive speed with the style of the game these days. So with somebody like McMillan, I think he's going to be bigger than average, as the league has trended a little smaller and faster. But that 8, 9, 10-year window, those guys that are still on the fringe of being bumped out of the data sample, those were some bigger guys. So I think that will help him as far as historical data, but I think relative to the rest of the linebackers that are running and are present this year, he's going to be below average.
That makes sense. And then cornerbacks, quick question. I'm not super interested in the specific cornerbacks, but just a question about the nature of cornerbacks. I know that the way the NFL treats cornerbacks a lot, especially recently, is it essentially only asks 2 questions without really taking into account any of these other questions, which is, how tall are you and how fast can you run? And there doesn't seem to be any discussion about, the vertical leap, any indication that vertical leap matters for NFL evaluators. There's no discussion about, agility scores or any indication that agility scores matter. It's just size. And then I guess arm length too, if you want to fold that into size and speed. Have you found that there's any indication that, these other testing, metrics matter? Do you find that, so for example, I found that in a small way, the short shuttle, which is actually, I think, more useless than a lot of people think, but for cornerbacks, I found the short shuttle to matter, and vertical to matter, and weight to matter, which is something that people don't talk about. They only talk about height and arm length. What have you found for cornerbacks to matter? Yeah,
height, weight, length, wingspan, or not wingspan, arm length, are the 3 factors that are put into the size portion of that physical size athleticism metric. And there's 4 athletic tests. It's the 40, the 10, the vertical, and the short shuttle. So we seem to be on the same page as far as what tests we're electing to use there.
All right. Well, I'm glad that you're
great minds think alike, right?
Yeah. All right, well, so that's interesting, because that's been a really interesting discussion for Vikings fans, because Xavier Rhodes had poor agility scores, but I thought his other athletic metrics, kind of overshadowed them. It was good enough. Sure. But Trey Waynes didn't. He was 186 as opposed to 200 pounds. He ran faster even. But I thought he had just poor testing in general. And it seems like after you account for weight, that these two players are actually very different. How did Trey Waynes score for you?
Waynes overall, he was in the I want to say the mid to late 40s as far as his placement on the board, but his size score was below average because of the weight. It was really lean, and the athleticism testing. Again, to keep going back to that same analogy with Eric Ebron as a tight end, just because it was the first one I brought up. Yeah, that 40-yard time's great. That 10-yard split's pretty good, but short shuttle, no. Vertical jump, no. So in the grand scheme of things, it was average testing across the 4 averaged scores that I gave for the 4 tests, and then below average for the size because of how small he was.
All right. Well, I'm glad that someone agrees with me. But I'm sorry, it's been a thorn in my side for a while. Let's talk about something way more interesting than the cornerbacks of this class, the safeties. Holy crap!
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of talk about Malik Hooker, a lot of talk about Jamal Adams, and then there's also some interesting talk about Obi Melifonwu and Budda Baker, and those are guys that not only could sneak into the first round. Some people, depending on who you talk to, like them better than either one or both of them, better than one or two of Hooker or Adams. Do you think that athletic testing is going to separate out those players a little bit? Melifonwu was supposed to test through the roof, or do you think that for safeties, hey, their film grade is probably closer to set in stone than people like to believe?
I enjoy seeing the foil between the film and the athleticism for them because there's some doozies in there historically as well between disconnect on what you see, particularly from strong safeties, guys that play up towards the line of scrimmage more and can get away with some of that stuff that linebackers get away with, that reactionary quickness and mental processing versus having twitch and explosiveness. But first of all, I'm bummed that Hooker's not going to participate since he had multiple surgeries to repair. I think it was a hernia and a shoulder issue. So he won't test. But I think the name that you didn't mention that I really want to see is Alabama's Eddie Jackson, who broke his leg.
Oh, yeah.
Mid-season. Coming into the year, I thought he was potentially a first-round caliber player, and nobody's talking about him. You break your leg, everybody forgets he exists. It's sad. Movement skills are really good. He came in as a corner. He's got some slot ability to play man-to-man coverage. I think Jamal Adams has that ability as well. I really like that multiplicity that those two guys are going to give you on the back end. Speaking of multiplicity, Budda Baker, you can ask him to do a whole bunch of different things, and he can do them and do them well. Melifonwu, more of a tight end matchup guy. I wouldn't like him a whole lot against some of the slot guys just because of how big and long he is. We had that conversation about how that can be physiologically restrictive. I think his straight line stuff's going to be great. I think his jumps are going to be great. I don't expect him to do exceptionally well in the change of direction skills as I would expect from either Jamal Adams or Budda Baker or even Eddie Jackson. But 3 out of 4 ain't bad, and he's going to come in really big in comparison to the other safeties that have passed through here. So he's probably going to help himself a good deal, just understanding that, you're not going to play him in man-to-man coverage against, slot receivers. He's going to be a tight end matchup guy, maybe somebody you walk up inside of 5 yards in collision and then carry down the field.
All right. And then before we I know Dusty has a couple of questions to ask, but I just want to get, quick thoughts. You're probably going to be wrong, and that's okay. No one's going to judge you for it. We're going to try and find.
Sorry, you will.
Yeah, but silently, so don't worry about it. We want to figure out who the best performers at each test is going to be. Could be a small school guy. You just shoot your shot. Geez. Yeah, I mean, whatever. Who cares? Who do you think is going to run the fastest 40?
I'll say Dalvin Cook.
All right. I think the popular pick would have been John Ross, so I like it. Who do you think is going to put up the most reps? This is the most unpredictable one.
Oh, man. Eddie Vanderdoes.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that. Vert.
Jeez. I'll say Chad Hansen.
Wow. All right. Broad, also Hansen or no?
No. I'll say Taywan Taylor because his reported broad is really impressive.
Oh, that's a good point. Also difficult to figure out. Short shuttle.
Let's go with Corn Elder.
Like it. 3-cone.
Oh, man. John Ross. I'll go John Ross there.
60-yard shuttle. I'm kidding.
Thank you.
All right, cool. Dusty, you got a couple questions you want to ask?
I mean, they're not so much my questions as they are like me being a conduit for a couple of questions that listeners have asked on Twitter.
Sure.
But Alex Goebel writes in, which player's stock do you expect to benefit the most from the combine and vice versa?
Yeah, well...
I know it's a tricky question to answer.
No, that's... I think pass rushers, there's a lot of shuffling of the deck to be had here. So I don't know necessarily if I would name two specific names, but I would say there's a lot of guys like 3 through 12 that are kind of pick your flavor, that if somebody comes in and tests really well, or if somebody comes in and just bombs their testing, it can have a pretty significant impact on players in that position group, in that tier of names that are talked about, because there's so many and there's so much depth that, you know, one slip can really cause some teams to really alter, you know, in their ranking of that position group where you fall.
All right. I got another one from Michael. When looking back, I assume he's talking about you specifically, Kyle. When looking back on drafted analyst picks for previous years, what hit percentage would you consider good?
If you're an analyst, I think it's harder to be an analyst than it is to be for a team, because you're viewing the players from a subjective, your own personal philosophy on the game. Where if you're working for a team, you at least have an archetype. You have defined traits that you're looking for, defined skills that you're looking for. As an outside guy, you got to be able to forecast that and have it be multiple for all 32 teams. So you'd almost be better off after the draft going back and saying, okay, this is my 1, 3, and 5 year forecast on this player. But I think if you're looking for a hit rate, if you're doing 50%, you're doing something really right. So maybe 4 out of 10. You got to feel really good about where you have the hit rate as far as your projection, not just for the value of the draft pick. I care so much less about getting the pick number right as I do, is this guy a good football player? Yeah,
did you value him correctly as opposed to, like, did you figure out where he's going to go? Yeah, I want to jump in real quick and answer a little, or not answer it, but like go into a little bit more detail. It's not just, you know, the teams have more specific requirements for their players, though that probably plays the biggest role. You know, hey, you know, if you're a two-gapping team and there's fewer and fewer and fewer of those, then, you know, if you draft, you know, Aaron Donald and put him as your two-gap nose tackle, he's just not going to be as good, you know, and it probably wouldn't be a hit for like the 9th overall or 8th overall pick or wherever he went. And you as an analyst don't have literally any control over that. And so if you say a player is good, goes to a system where he's going to be bad and he's bad, you know, that looks bad for you. And so that's a huge problem. But there's also like a couple of other things. Teams have access to medical information that we don't have. No one knew that TJ Clemmings was going to fall to the 4th round, which, you know, I guess thank God he did. Because of his foot injury, right? No one knew, right? You know, no one knew, you know, how far a lot of these players are going to fall as a result. Well, who's that nose tackle from? I think Jesse Williams from Alabama.
Yeah.
And he had a knee thing. I don't think anybody knew about it. Well, I think there were some rumors that he had a knee problem, but no one knew how severe that knee thing was.
How about Antonio Richardson from Tennessee, who was talked about as a first-round tackle and then went undrafted?
Yeah, I thought he was going to be a second-round pick. I thought it was an amazing undrafted free agent signing for the Vikings, which in retrospect still was because risk assessment. And, he had a degenerative knee condition. Like, we don't have access to that information. And so if you say Antonio Richardson's going to be good and he falls and you don't find out why he falls, because a lot of times we don't, that's a mark on you, and maybe that's not fair either. And then also there's the interviews. If a player doesn't love football, Eddie Lacy, then he loves probably food, don't know that. He loves food. Foodball for sure. But if he doesn't like playing football, you don't have access to the information. Teams might, which that's actually kind of also a problem with Matt Khalil when we get back to it. And that's something that you as an analyst don't have the ability to weigh. And so it is difficult to figure out what a hit is and what your hit rate should be and whether or not you should count injuries as failures and stuff like that. I will say I will have my first set of 3-year grades for the analysts. So Krabs, you're on that list.
Can't wait for that.
Yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to release after the combine, but well before the draft, so that we know who we hate and then we can make fun of them online. Speaking of, haven't mentioned this yet, Krabs so far is the 3-year champion. I might as well just retire it now. Of what I call the Odd Duck Award. It's the guy who has the most unique rankings relative to everybody else in the draft, which means he actually has the most to stand to gain or lose from this sort of post-3-year draft autopsy.
2014 is an L for me. I can tell you that already.
That's not going to be good then. But
no,
yeah,
that was the year I retroactively looked back, because it was the first year I'd implemented the system and looked at all these stylistic dilemmas that I had, and I changed a lot going into 2015, and I felt a lot better about the board and the way it fell, changed positional premium position bonuses and propping up certain positions because they play a premium position, and a lot of changes. So that first year was really helpful to get it into an applied situation and use it. But I can tell you I changed quite a bit after 2014, so I would not be surprised if I take some else there.
All right, well, we'll stick a sticker on you to tell people not to pay attention to you. And then the very next thing we're going to do is promote your guide in a second. I think we've got a couple more questions, though.
I actually have just one.
Okay.
We have a long tradition on Norse Code of entertaining moderately off-topic questions. And so to honor you, Kyle, and bring you into the fold, Zen Cupid asks us all, what event/drill at the Combine would each of you excel at?
Christ.
Arif, I want to know what your answer is.
There's one very obvious answer.
No. We're adjusting for size, right? We get a size.
Yeah, we'll normalize your data. That's fine.
I would destroy the Combine then.
So
except the bench press.
I was going to say, can either of you bench press 225 once?
I might be able to once.
I can do between 16 and 18 reps on 225.
I cannot do 18 reps on that's nope. I think people will assume that it's the short shuttle, in part because of the name. I think probably the 3-cone would be my best event, but I think I have an underrated vert for my size, relative to my size, and 40. I'm just putting that out there. What about you, Krabs?
Well, I weigh like a strong safety. I test like a quarterback. So probably, I don't know. I think 16 to 18 on 225 is pretty good, but my verts, I think last time I did it was 3 years ago. I was at a tryout for an indoor team, and I jumped 32 and a half on the vert. So I would probably either say the bench or the vert.
Yeah, that's better than me. All right.
Yeah, but yours is normalized, though.
Right. Well, the problem is everything is normalized, right? And so my height, but then also my weight, I should actually be performing better relative to my weight. I just realized that.
Yeah, don't fine details, man. It's just fine details.
Thought about it the absolute wrong way. Anyway,
realizing that like one of us on the panel here is an actual like athlete.
Don't worry about it.
Well, that's why I suspect that I would perform best on the Wonderlic, obviously, but it's still second chair to Arif.
It's a smart answer. I bet he would do well in the Wonderlic.
Beyond that, I like my chances at the Cybex test and subject it to that, like injury evaluations. I've somehow managed to make it to 35 years old without any football-related injuries. And I swear to God, it's not just because I don't play football.
I would do poorly in the Cybex and the 60-yard, but 60-yard doesn't matter. So.
Oh, really? See, I thought you would do best at like the Wonderlic and the 60-yard shuttle. Those were the two events that I had picked out for you.
The 60-yard shuttle is a conditioning test. That's nope.
Well, but you like, I don't know. I just assumed as a short person who didn't smoke, you would have a natural advantage.
I can run like 3 miles without stopping. I just can't do it fast.
No, tough but fair. All right, no, that's all the mailbag has got. Kyle,
talk about your guide, which is going to be awful because of how bad 2014 was.
Oh yeah, well, thanks. Really promising lead. This is we're doing a new delivery model this year. In the past, it's been a document that I've distributed when it was done. This year, we're actually implementing an online database, which I'm really excited about. Both me and Joe Marino, who's my right-hand guy over at NDT, we have agreed to a watch list of 300 guys, and each of us are putting through our own respective systems this group of 300 players, and you're going to get 600 assessments, 300 from myself, 300 from Joe. It's going to be available at ndtscouting.com within the next couple weeks. We're doing a facelift to the site, so we've got a lot of changes going on, and that's why that's not available yet. But it's going to be really great, just to kind of have a really substantial library. We're going to have 2016's reports in there as well. We're going to have 2015 reports on there that will be free to the public, though. So you're going to have 300 free, and then another 900 reports from 2016, 300 and 600 from 2017 that are going to be available. And that should be within the next 2 weeks that pre-orders will kick up for that. So we're really excited to get that rolling.
That sounds fantastic. No, as much as I bag on crabs, it's actually a really good guide. I've gotten a copy of it every year, and I definitely recommend picking it up. Obviously, you can tell from the podcast that Crabs knows what he's talking about, and then with the addition of Joe Marino to the guide, you're going to get a bunch of really good football knowledge about a bunch of players, most of whom will probably get drafted if they're doing the job right.
Well, and the caveat to that is this year we're actually doing an expansion pack after the draft.
Expansion, that sounds like a nice board game.
Yeah, right? So anybody that's selected 5th round or earlier that we do not cover, we will retroactively do an assessment on. And again, because our goal is not to be right on where the player's picked, we're forecasting career success. So we'll do those players so that anybody that invests in the guide, if you get some off-the-radar 4th round selection, like what the Arizona Cardinals did with that Delaware State kid the other year, we will go out of our way to go back and give those guys to you after the fact so that you can read up on what we think of those guys as well.
Does that mean you would have gotten an evaluation on Joey Cordona, long snapper from Navy?
Yeah, we would have had to do Joey Cordona, which would have been fun.
Well, that sounds like a great deal. Well, thanks for coming on the show, man. Anything else you want to plug?
No, just keep listening to my man Dusty and my man Arif. You
don't have to plug us on our own show. They're already listening to it.
Yeah, well, I wanted to keep listening. That's what I'm telling them.
Well, let's keep it. I appreciate it. Dusty, don't tell him to shut up.
I appreciate it, but I'm just saying, I feel like this might be a more effective venue for you to plug you and your homeboy Joe Marino on the Draft Dudes podcast. Which
look at that, you're doing it for me. So we're scratching each other's backs here. This works out great.
See, this is true professionalism on display here. I'm loving it.
It's great.
This is like when it's like crunch time in a game and the teams just keep turning the ball over because nobody wants to win. That's what this is right now.
Oh, man. Well, hey, thanks for being on the show, Kyle. We look forward to having you back as your busy schedule allows. I imagine this is kind of getting to be like crunch time for you.
Yeah, I've got 5 weeks left of player assessments. It's about 8 to 10 hours a day, every day. Trying to get 300 reports done by the 1st of April. So when we get into April, things will calm down a little bit, but this is the last big push. But I'm excited because, you do all this work all year long, and to finally have a tangible final product and final scores on players after the combine is like one of my top experiences of the year. So I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, we do as well. And hopefully we'll have you back on someday to talk about the after effects. Once we figure out just how big of a bust 2014 was for you, we can have you on and serve you some crow.
Yeah, I've certainly set myself up for success with that admission, but I'm looking forward to coming back on and eating all the crow you guys can serve.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Kyle. That's actually probably going to do it for this episode of Norse Code. I know there's a few more questions in the mailbag, but given that this is primarily a combine preview, we'll save that stuff for next week.
We'll do it next week, yeah.
I suppose. You can find Norse Code wherever fine podcasts are aggregated, as well as NorseCodePodcast.com. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/Daily Norseman. DailyNorseman.com is the SB Nation blog that's been kind enough to host us since day one. And the rest of the details are in the outro there. But yeah, make sure you check out Kyle Krabs at NDT Scouting on Twitter, ndtscouting.com. And of course, the Draft Dudes podcast and the NFL Draft Prospectus, which Arif is not joking. We rely on that every year to a medium to large extent because it is so good. So for Kyle and Arif, and all of us here at Norse Code, spoons out. We'll see you next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, or wherever else fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, who can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. Our intrepid producer and occasional co-host James Pagachnik can be found on Twitter at Big Mono or curating the official Norse Code Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. I'm your host with a firm grasp of the obvious, Dusty O'Connell, and my name is my handle on Twitter. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, your one-time donation can be made at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Please visit our website, NorseCodePodcast.com, where you'll find links to our Facebook and YouTube pages, along with the episode archive and some other good stuff. And any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be emailed to NorseCodePodcast.com. On behalf of James and Arif, my name is Dusty, and we all thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.